budget, sir. Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I would actually like to start by doing something probably a little unusual. That's to congratulate Maurice Williamson on actually referring to the budget in his speech. It's the first time I've heard anybody from that side of the House actually talk about this budget and to try and actually promote the budget from the National Party point of view. We heard Chris Finlayson talking about 1978 and what previous Labour governments have done and what Labour Party policy might be. But Maurice Williamson actually tried to talk about the budget. Having said that, Mr Speaker, of course I have to take some exception to some of the points that he made. He talked about. I know. Mr. Williamson is tremendously surprised at the position that I'm taking. But Mr. Williamson talked about the plan for growth and the income side of the ledger. Actually, it was interesting to hear him talking about the income side of the ledger because that is precisely what is missing from this budget. There is no plan for growth, there is no plan for jobs, and there is no plan for creating a good, stable business environment. Mr. Williamson talked about businesses appreciating the fact that they will have customers who will have money in their pockets who will buy those businesses' products. Well, there's absolutely nothing in this budget to put money into the pockets of working families, working New Zealanders. People will be no better off as a result of this budget. In fact, the only thing that this budget focuses on doing is cuts. Cuts to the public sector. That is the only focus in this budget. It is entirely focused on expenditure. So cuts to KiwiSaver, cuts to working for families. Those are the sorts of things that actually make working New Zealanders more nervous about their financial situation, less likely to go out and spend money. That's bad news for businesses in New Zealand who will not take on more workers and will not create more jobs in the country. So it is in fact the exact opposite of what Mr Williamson was claiming this budget is all about. But nevertheless, I appreciate the fact that Mr Williamson actually attempted to talk about the budget itself, because I understand why National Party members would refrain from talking about the budget itself, because it is a lacklustre budget. It lacks a credible plan. It lacks any sort of plan for growth. It lacks any sort of plan for jobs. It lacks any sort of plan for getting on top of the $16.7 billion deficit that this government has created in just the 3 years that it's been in charge. Of course, you wouldn't want to put your name to this budget. Mr Speaker, I particularly want to talk about the very lacklustre approach to healthcare that this budget takes. $165 million. That is the gap between what the government is prepared to spend on health and what is needed just for healthcare to stand still. It isn't good enough to get up and say that the government is spending more on healthcare than it ever has before. Of course it's spending more on healthcare than it ever has before. Every government, Mr Coleman, every government spends, I'll take that, Dr Coleman, every government spends more on healthcare each year than it did the year before. The question is, what is the quantum? What is the quantum? Is it enough? Is it enough to keep up with inflation? We know that inflation in the health system is far, far greater than it is in everyday life. So people are struggling with 4.5% inflation in everyday life. Grant Robertson said people go to the supermarket. They are spending more on their groceries than they ever have before, but it doesn't mean they're getting more for it. And although we are spending more on healthcare, we are not getting more for our health dollar. So why is the government getting up and crowing about something which actually every single government has done every year before? That's the question. Because this minister and this government has got their health priorities absolutely up the spout, completely in the wrong place. Because as important as it is to focus on elective surgeries and waiting lists, noble things that we have to get our heads around and get tackling, the fact of the matter is that the government is sucking money out of what actually will improve our health system over time and what will improve the health of New Zealanders over time, and that is public health care. We need to keep people well in this country. We need to keep people well in this country so that we can reduce the demand on our health services, which are already stretched. But there is no plan. There is absolutely no plan in this government no plan from this government to improve the well-being of New Zealanders. And that means that for year after year, the demand on our health system will simply remain the same, if not get worse, as our population ages, as we see more and more problems in our population, because we all know, Mr. Speaker, that the greater the disparity between the haves and the have-nots, the more health issues we will see in our nation. And this government is actually creating a much greater gap between those that have and those that don't have. That growing inequality is actually going to cause more cost in the health system over time than any other thing that this government could possibly do. This is the second budget in a row that fails to meet the cost of delivering current health services. And if this track continues, then our health system is going to be in a huge amount of trouble in a very, very short period of time. Mr. Speaker, the cost of living in this country is an issue which every New Zealander is having to grapple with, as costs go way beyond what people can actually afford as their wages stay static. And one of the things, and this is important for the health system, one of the things that helps to keep the cost of living under control in this country is affordable medicines, both through Pharmac and through the fact that the government subsidises prescriptions so that people can get medicines at a reasonable rate. There is a huge threat looming to that situation where medicines are affordable in this country, and that is the fact that as we negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this government is not prepared to take Pharmac off the bargaining table. They are not prepared to say to New Zealanders, we value affordable medicine in this country, we value the fact that people are able to access medicines at an affordable rate, that cost is no barrier to getting medicine in this country. They're not prepared to say to New Zealanders that we value the fact that our health system saves $700 million every year because of the way that Pharmac acts. They're not prepared to say that. They're not prepared to take that off the table. That is something that would give New Zealanders some assurity, but they're just simply not prepared to do it, and it's about time. It is about time that the government was unequivocal and said, because we have a fantastic system in Pharmac that keeps the cost of living down in New Zealand, that makes medicines affordable and accessible, that we are not going to negotiate that away for anything. Yes, things have to go on the table. Bargaining, that's what bargaining is all about. But there is nothing that can be worth bargaining away our access to affordable medicine in this country, and it is well overdue time for this government to say that Pharmac is coming off the bargaining table. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the fact that the government is underfunding our health system to the tune of $165 million, they have dumped another huge pressure on district health boards, and that is by refusing to fund the cost of health workers' KiwiSaver schemes. That in itself is worth $45 million. That is $45 million extra dollars that the district health boards around this country are going to have to find out of their budgets. Their budgets every year, those budgets which are already being stretched by the $165 million gap, that add to that the $45 million gap in KiwiSaver and wages for health workers. That money has to come from somewhere. It can only come from one of two places, either cuts to health services or increased charges to patients. People do not need to be paying any more to go to the doctor. It is enough of a barrier, the cost of going to the doctor. We don't need new charges being brought into the health system. Mr. Speaker, it is outrageous that the government stands up and says what a wonderful job it is doing for our health system when it is effectively cutting money out of the system, and then washing its hands and telling the DHBs that they have to find those cuts. Mr. Speaker, this is a lacklustre budget. It does nothing for hard-working Kiwis. It does nothing for business in New Zealand. It does nothing for growth. It does nothing for jobs, and it is abysmal on healthcare. There's no wonder the opposition is so deeply opposed to this budget.
Chris Ockenvoll.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.